All right, guys, so we're moving on to the Maximiser inside of Ozone 7, and this is arguably outside of the dynamics, probably one of the most important modules in it. You'll pretty much see it in every mastering chain preset in Ozone. This is what can help your mix kind of get that commercial loudness factor. So basically, it's a limiter, but it's a very unique limiter. So just calling it a limiter is kind of, I don't know, it's not doing it justice as to what it does. So it's a very basic looking module. You have these 4 different limiting modes, which are going to tell the Maximiser how to kind of read the incoming audio. And the IRC stands for Intelligent Release Control. It is Ozone's proprietary type algorithm that is very musical. So with a lot of limiters, if you limit too hard, you will lose clarity and dynamics. With this, it's kind of hard to actually lose clarity and dynamics, which is nice. So it's very musical, and it's one of, in my opinion, the reasons you pay good money on Ozone or Ozone 7 Advanced. So you have these 4 different modes, and IRC3 has some different presets or kind of modes within that mode. Same with IRC4. And we're going to talk about what each mode is and what it does, how it affects the sound a little bit in just a few minutes. Now, if you move over to the right, you have fairly typical controls that you'll see on pretty much every limiter. You have a ceiling, which is going to be the max level of output in decibels. So setting it to 0.1 is usually a good call. Then you have the threshold under that, which is going to tell it when to start. When the audio crosses over that threshold, it'll start doing the limiting. Now, over here, you have a attack and release slider, just like you kind of do in some of the other modules. So instead of giving you attack and release, it gives you this kind of variable attack and release. You have fast, I almost said smashed. You have fast, smooth, transparent, and slow. And then you have a stereo link control and a transient emphasis, which we will look at in a minute. So some of the key features of this is, like I said, it keeps things musical. It can make it pump, it can make it louder, but it keeps the clarity of your mix. The character control, this right here, is going to help you actually really fine-tune how the Maximiser works. And the reason why in my opinion, this character control exists is so this Maximiser can be basic on the control side of things, right? It's just modes, your ceiling threshold. There's not an in-depth attack, release, knee, all that sort of stuff. It's so you can use it with different genres. So if it was like a hip-hop, aggressive 808 type track, I might have it on fast to get some of those transients. If it's more of a singer-songwriter thing, I might go slow. It just depends on your source material. Now, the stereo link feature allows you to limit the left and right channels independently, which is pretty cool. And the transient emphasis allows you to preserve transients through the limiting. So if you turn it on, up to 200 is the max. So if you're losing clarity in your kick, you can mess with this. All right, so of the limiting modes, you get these 4 different modes. They stand for, the IRC stands for Intelligent Release Control. IRC1 provides intelligent digital loudness maximization of the signal. That's per the Ozone manual. That's what they say it does. So it's very musical. Let's listen to it.
Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and...
All right, so you can see here I'm at negative 2.6 decibels. If we look over here on my master fader, let's get that to 0.
Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the...
All right, I'm pulling up Logic's multimeter, and we'll see how this is affecting RMS levels and my overall peak level.
Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see, took the looking in the mirror of who I see, took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. And nothing's tearing me apart. I can't help it, I'm shameless. Never sorry to say it. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I
right, so it's pretty loud right now. I have it on the IRC1. Let's try listening to this course section with the IRC2.
I can't help it, I'm saying this. Never sorry to say.
So this is similar to IRC1, except its algorithm is going to preserve the transients even more so. So they sound a little bit, to my ear, rounder and a little bit clearer. So you can do some aggressive limiting with this. And this has more effect once you have other modules before it. So let's actually throw in the dynamics module before it, and we'll load up a preset on this. We'll do, let's do gentle dynamics, and now we have both of these things going on. So the Maximiser plays nicely with what you have going on. Usually the chain in Ozone 7 is going to be EQ, dynamics, maybe an imager, post EQ, then maybe if you want to color your sound, one of the vintage modules. Maximiser is usually the last thing on your chain.
I can't help it, I'm saying this. Never sorry to say. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. Part. I can't help it, I'm saying this. Never sorry to say. Take it or leave it, better believe part. I can't help it, I'm saying this. Never sorry to say. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. I know some of you hate it, but I'll never be shaken. Take it or
All right, so there's IRC2. Let's try IRC3. Now the IRC3 allows, it's the most aggressive of the three or of the four modes within the Maximiser. Let's just listen to this and then I'll explain what it's doing.
apart. I can't help it, I'm saying this. Never sorry to say. Take it or leave it, better believe I'm right where I belong. I know some of you hate it, but I'll never be.
All right, so these different modes here within the IRC3, they're going to affect the release time. So it's going to give it a different feel, because when you mess with the release of a limiter, it can really make it either way more punchy or way less punchy. It depends. I will say that the IRC3 hits my CPU pretty darn hard. This is sometimes if you're at higher sampling rates, it will add a noticeable latency. I like using IRC1 or 2. I'm not a huge IRC3 fan because of that. But like I said, if you have a powerful enough computer and you want that kind of choice between how the limiter mode, the IRC3, is going to deal with the release times, you have a lot of control over it. They do sound good. I do like the crisp one.
Looking in the mirror, love who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm.
All right, so let's talk about these different modes here. Pumping. Pumping it's one of the least aggressive of this aggressive IRC3, which is kind of a weird oxymoron to say, but it's going to add that kind of classic pumping limiter compressor feel. It has more of so it's going to be a slower release time. So when you have things that pump with a compressor, they're usually pumping is synonymous with lower or slower release times. Now the next one you get is balanced. Balanced is, as the name suggests, kind of a good mix between, it's like a medium release time. It's not slow, it's not fast. How that affects the sound is it makes it fairly transparent. You're going to be able to increase your volume, but it's not going to sound like there's a lot of limiting going on. Now next you have crisp. This is a pretty harsh one to my ear. I actually am not a huge fan of this. It adds a little bit of distortion, a little bit of pumping, a little bit of distortion. It might have its place with rock or different types of music that I don't do a bunch. I could actually see it working very well with rock, but EDM type stuff, it's not my favorite one. And then lastly, you have clipping. This is the most aggressive mode within the IRC3 mode, which is the most aggressive of the four main modes. So it's going to color your mix. It's very aggressive. It's very in your face. It'll have a little bit of distortion, and it's going to be able to get the highest level of loudness factor without actually creating too much digital clipping. All right, let's go to IRC4. So this is one of the newer modes. This builds on the existing IRC3 modes that were in previous versions of Ozone. This algorithm is going to kind of attack frequency bands that are contributing to the majority of your peaks in the audio. So it's a little bit different. It's a little bit of a I would call it an intelligent IRC mode, because it's not just looking at overall audio, it's looking at frequency bands. So classic, you get 3 different modes within the IRC4 mode. You get classic, modern, and transient. Classic is going to just enhance the overall mix and sound more. Sounds a little bit like Ozone's older versions of limiting algorithms, like Ozone's 5 and 6. Modern is one of my favorites. Modern is going to enhance your mix loudness, but it's very clean, and it adds a lot of nice detail. It keeps the detail of your mix, rather. It doesn't add. It doesn't sacrifice, because sometimes when you limit things too harshly, you lose a little bit of clarity.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the
All right. And then you get transient. Transient is an interesting one. So this mode or this style is going to preserve as many of the transients as possible, and it makes it for a highly detailed sound. I love the transient mode for genres of EDM or hip-hop where it's very transient rich, like Main Room or anything with a bunch of 808, really snappy, crisp snares. I really like the transient mode in the IRC4. All right, let's move over now to the control here. Threshold and ceiling, we already kind of talked about. The threshold is going to determine in decibels when the maximizer will begin limiting. The ceiling is going to be the maximum output. I usually like to have that about 0.1 just to play it safe. Because if you have a mix that peaks at 0.1 and the commercial mix mixed by some mastering engineer who's been mastering for 40, 30 years, peaks at 0.1 of a tenth of a decimal place, isn't a noticeable difference to the ear, really. So next you get the character. This is going to customize the overall response time, so the attack and release of the limiter and the maximizer. So it's kind of this cool idea where it's not just it's just not fast, it's not just slow, smooth, not just transparent, not just slow. You can be anywhere in between it, which is really nice. So you can really get this kind of continuous range through the 4 different characters of how it's handling the attack and release. And this slider will have different results when you're in different IRC modes. So play around with that. There is no kind of catch-all. I can't say do this for that, because it really does depend on your mix. But do play around with the character in each of the modes, and you'll start to see, or maybe you'll start to hear a mode that really works for your type of music that you do, or your favorite type of genres that you're mixing or producing in. Now the stereo unlink, the Ozone limiter defaults to 0% at the unlinking, which is going to mean that the maximizer is equal across the entire stereo image. Well, you can control the left or right channels independently. So it goes from a 0% all the way up to 100%. And if you are 50% and below, you're going to be kind of working in the stereo image main channels. And if you're 50% or higher, it's going to kind of favor the individual channel's gain. So let's listen to this.
looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
So depending on how wide of a mix you have, like this I feel like would be very helpful in genres where you have a lot of instruments out left and right. Not so much with pop because it's a pretty sparse mix, but think maybe like country or something where you have banjo out left, you have a mandolin out left a lot, multiple guitars, potentially a piano, that sort of stuff. This might be a fun thing to play around with. Now next you get the transient emphasis. So this is a transient shaper, and it goes from a value of 0 to 200. So this is just basically going to help you optimize loudness. So it helps you not make a compromise between optimizing your loudness factor with the IRC modes and the limiting, and losing your transients in that process. So if you start to lose your transients with the IRC mode, try turning this up. Now sometimes when you have to turn this up, you might have to adjust the threshold because there is a little bit of push and pull between the two, it appears, and you don't want to create any digital clipping. Now you get two different visuals. You get the main threshold meter right here, or the gain reduction trace, and then you get the spectrum.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and
so this will actually, right now I don't have any gain reduction going on.
looking in the mirror of who I see. I took the mask off, here's the real me. The chains and now I'm living free.
All right, so I'm going to exaggerate this just so you can see.
Looking in the mirror of who I see.
You can see that as I'm playing it, there's this kind of like squiggle. If you zoomed in, it'd kind of be like traces of audio lines, but it's telling you where it's reducing the gain. I did an extreme setting. I'm not saying this is a good setting. This is a terrible setting that sounded like ass, but You get the idea. That's what it's doing. It's going to trace and show you when it's reducing gain. Now, with your mix, it shouldn't be a constant gain reduction. It really shouldn't. Especially if you have other modules before it, like the dynamics, maybe a compressor or a limiter. You shouldn't be gain reducing everything. That's just going to squash your mix and get a lifeless result. So you shouldn't see this stuff like this. This is wrong. This is bad. You wouldn't want that.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free.
All right, so typically you'll see a little bit on the kick, maybe the snare, and maybe if you have some huge type of instrument like a drop in EDM like dubstep or some huge electro type drop, it might be there as well, or future bass or future house. I could see it having, you know, some effect on the main drop sound. And then you also get a spectrum analyzer graph.
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm living free. Looking in the mirror of who I see.
All right, and if you hover over this middle line where it says the decibels, you can actually shrink and kind of see how it says -30, or you can zoom in. So
Looking in the mirror of who I see. Took the mask off, here's the real me. Broke the chains and now I'm
I usually like having it zoomed out so I can see the whole line trace. But that is the Maximiser inside of Ozone 7. Very powerful plugin, very powerful tool. It's usually, like I said, the last thing you'll see on a preset. So let's actually load up a whole preset chain. You'll see that if we go Brighten Overall Mix, there's the Maximiser last, CD Master, Maximiser, Control Dynamics, Maximiser's last, Maximiser's last. So it's usually the last thing you'll put. I'm trying to reiterate that point. If you're putting your Maximiser first, you've done something wrong, because you should equalize dynamics and then maybe some of the other plugins that we haven't talked about yet, or modules like the Exciter or Imager, and then maximize it. That should be the last thing, because it is telling it not to go higher than this. You have an output ceiling. And the way that it kind of works, it pairs nicely with the dynamics and the other elements of Ozone 7. All right, guys, I'll see you in the next video.